Welcome to the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Hey everybody, Matt Colville here, and we are going to spend an episode talking about making characters from the DM's point of view. This is not the how do you make characters video. There are lots of resources online for doing that kind of stuff. This is specifically a video about the types of things that tend to confuse players and the stuff they tend to argue about. And there are really two subjects here. The first subject is generating your ability scores and how that works, and the second subject is making a party. So, part one, generating your ability scores. Everything your character does in Dungeons & Dragons is based in one way or another on one of their 6 ability scores. Strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Everything else you do in the game, when you make an attack roll, when you roll damage, when you try to cast a spell, when you use one of your skills, ultimately comes back to which of your 6 ability scores are you using to do that. Why are there 6? Well, there's no real answer to that. It's arbitrary. There are other role-playing games that use 3, and there are some that use 9. Dungeons & Dragons uses 6, and that's reasons why I think are lost in the mist of time. Each ability score has 2 numbers associated with it. Why 2 numbers? Well, that's because the first number is kind of an homage to the early days of D&D. Once you generate that first number between 3 and 18 for each of the 6 stats, you really don't use it again. All it's good for is looking up the second number. So you have 6 stats, and each stat has 2 numbers associated with it, but really you only need that second number. So the first number is called your ability score, and the second number is called your ability modifier. And the first number, your ability score, is a number between 3 and 18, but realistically it's between 8 and 18. It's very rare these days that you see characters with scores like 3 or 4. Why 3 to 18? Well, because that's what you get from a 3d6 distribution curve. Why 3d6? Well, back in 1974, when Gary Gygax was designing this game, the entire game ran on d6s. That was the only die they had. Your character used a d6 for hit points, and really strong characters got a d6 plus 1, and weak characters got a d6 minus 1, and all of the weapons used a d6, and a really powerful weapon might do 2d6, and a weak weapon might do a d6 minus 2. So the entire game was run on 6-sided dice, and they wanted to generate a random number with a certain range, and they went with 3d6 because it gives you a nice bell curve, and so that's where that number comes from, 3 to 18, 3d6, because they had 6-sided dice. They wanted a bell curve, and now we're kind of stuck with it, even though once you've generated that character at the beginning of character creation, you really don't use it again. And to make it more confusing, we don't use 3d6 anymore. We use 4d6, and we drop the lowest die and then add these 3 together. I've often had players, when I say, okay, it's time to generate our stats, let's sit down and roll, they roll 4d6 because I've told them to, and they think those 4 numbers are their stats. Of course they think that. Why would they think anything else? And then they get surprised when they have to do that 5 more times. So if you're new to D&D and you've never played before, this is the kind of stuff your players are going to wonder about. And you just got to explain to them, look, we're going to generate 6 stats, and each stat is generated by rolling 4 6-sided dice, dropping the lowest die, and then adding these 3 together to get a number between 3 and 18. But by dropping the lowest die, we generate a number that is a little bit higher than the average you would get. It's very kludgy. It's very kind of hard to explain why we're doing this. We start by assuming a range from 3 to 18, but then we want extraordinary characters. Normal people in D&D have stats between 3 and 18, and their average is somewhere around 10.5. But your character is extraordinary. You're a hero. So the way we differentiate your character from a normal character is instead of rolling 3d6, you roll 4d6 and drop the lowest one. That tends to generate higher numbers. Once you've generated those 6 numbers, you then look each of those up on a table that tells you what your modifier is. And then from then on, you use your modifier. I mean, I think there are 1 or 2 things in the game that actually use your ability score, but overwhelmingly, we're just looking for this other number that ranges from -4 to +4. So that right there, I think, is one of the most confusing things that brand new players have to deal with. Why are we generating these numbers? What do they mean? And what am I using them for? After I've generated my ability scores, each one of them is a lookup to a modifier. And once I know that modifier, that's what I use from then on. If my modifier from strength is +3, that means when I'm trying to do something strength related, like attack with a melee weapon or use my athletics, I roll a 20-sided die and I add the modifier from my strength. Hit points determine how survivable my character is, and that's affected by my constitution. So when I roll my hit points, I roll a die, and then I add the modifier for my constitution. The -4 to +4 is something D&D lifted from a game called Ars Magica. Actually, they might have lifted it from Fudge. Either way, around the year 2000, they decided to simplify everything and make everything more straightforward, which it is, trust me. But we still have that legacy of 3d6 and then 4d6, take the highest 3. Now, there are 2 ways to generate these ability scores. There's the random way I've been talking about, but some players don't like that. Actually, it's usually up to the GM. It's usually up to you to determine how do you want your characters to generate their stats. It is your game, game and it takes place in your world, so you kind of have the privilege of deciding how are we going to do these things. And of course, a lot of DMs decide it's up to the players, and some players can do it randomly and some players can do it the other way. The other way is just by using this list of numbers in the player's handbook. I believe it's 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15. So you get a 13, a 14, a 15, which tend to give you some nice bonuses, but you have an 8, which is -1. So there's going to be one stat that you're not that good at. And that's always fun to roleplay. It's neat to have a character who is good. He's heroic. He's got 1 or 2 stats that are really good, but he's got 1 stat that's not that great. And it makes your character kind of interesting. You're a really strong fighter, but you're kind of dumb, or you're a really smart wizard, but you're really clumsy. I've often had wizard players who put their worst stat in Constitution because they like that fantasy of being incredibly powerful intellectually, but being frail physically, maybe even being sick. So why choose one method over the other? Why use random generation as opposed to just taking this list of numbers? Well, it's down to your philosophy as a DM and as a player. The random generation method is fun. It is fun to roll dice. I mean, an axiom in the strict Euclidean sense, in that we can't really question why is it like that. We just have to accept it. People like rolling dice. And traditionally, and to my mind preferably, we roll these dice and generate our ability scores and make our characters together at the table, because it's fun to watch other people roll and see what they get. It's fun to go, woo, when they get an 18, or ooh, when they get a 3, or some players it's the other way around and they go hee hee when they get a 3, or when they get an 18. So it's fun to roll dice, and that's one of the reasons we do it randomly. It's also fun to discover your character. I don't know what my stats are going to be, but one of the problems with that is you don't know what your stats are going to be. So you could end up with a character that has really impossibly high stats, or another character that just has a bunch of really low, terrible stats. And it doesn't even have to be that extreme to not be fun or to be unbalancing. You can only have 1 or 2 really poor stats, but they could cripple a character. And it's tough for you, the DM. It puts you in a tough spot, because if you have one player that has really high stats because he rolled really well, and the rest of the players have average or poor stats because they didn't roll that well, then when you're challenging the player that has great stats, you're in danger of wiping out the rest of the party. But if you're challenging these characters, then this character is just going to walk right through everything and not feel challenged. Now, these are extreme examples. I have players in my Tuesday night game at work where one of them is basically Hercules, because I think his lowest stat is like a 15, and the other players have average stats. But so far, there hasn't really been any problem with that because they all like each other, so they don't mind that Tom is just unstoppable. But not all players are like that. Some players are legitimately going to be upset because why did that guy get great stats? I'm spending hours every week playing this character and his stats suck. So that's why DMs use the list. I think they used to call it the matrix. Not that matrix. It's a list of 6 numbers, and they're the same 6 numbers for everybody. So you put your 15 in intelligence if you want to be a wizard. I put my 15 in strength if I'm going to be a fighter. But we both have a 15, just like we both have a 14 and a 13, and an 8 that we have to pick what stat is going to be the bad one. And that makes everything fair, but it also makes everything kind of boring. So that's up to you. It's up to you to decide, do you want that juice from rolling things randomly? It's exciting to see what people get, but it can kind of be unfair sometimes. Or do you want everything to be fair, but also kind of boring? There are other options. It's your game. In fact, there's a whole list, I remember, of ways to generate characters in the Unearthed Arcana published in 1982. And one of them was crazy. Like, if you're going to be a wizard, you roll 9 dice for your intelligence and take the highest 3, because that almost guarantees you get an 18. But if you're playing a wizard for your strength, you literally only roll 3 dice and that's it. Because they wanted that feeling of rolling dice, but they also wanted to make sure that your important stats were going to be high. It's a weird kludgy method, but it's just an example of how there are lots of ways to generate stats. There's a method called point buy, where every player starts with the same number of points, and each type of stat, like a 12 or a 13, costs a different amount. And higher stats cost more. So an 18 costs more than 1 more than 17. And that lets players customize their characters and maybe get, instead of a 15 for their high stat, get an 18 for their high stat. But then instead of an 8 for their low stat, they might have a 6 for their low stat. So there's a point buy method that's described in the DM's guide. And there's my method, which might be unique to me, but is based on my history with the game and the stuff I tend to like. I have my players roll 4d6, take the highest 3, the random stat method, but then I don't let them put those stats where they want. The first die roll is their strength, because that's the first stat. Their second die roll is their dexterity, because that's the second stat. I do that for a very specific reason. It's because I am often playing the game with new players. I enjoy introducing the game to new players, and I happen to work at a video game company where there are tons of people who want to play D&D but never have before. And one of the problems with new players, especially new players that are not super plugged into the fantasy role-playing experience, they've never played a game like Baldur's Gate, or I'm trying to think of what or Dragon's Age. They've never played a game like that, and so they don't know the archetypes. So instead, they bring some existing character that they're familiar with to the table. They think it would be cool to play Wolverine as an example. And the problem with that is the rules of D&D don't know who these characters are, so they're not really designed to simulate those things, and those players get really frustrated. They're constantly fighting against their idea of who their character should be. You know, Wolverine has self-healing, Wolverine has claws and melee combat, and what the rules allow or permit or really even expect. I mean, you can do anything you want in D&D. You could make a character like Wolverine, but it would take you and the DM sitting down together and figuring out, okay, how are we going to do this? And that's a lot of work, especially for a new DM. So the rules of D&D aren't designed to simulate these existing characters that the player is familiar with from comic books or movies or anime, and as a result, they get really frustrated. So the way I break the back of that problem is with this method. At the end of rolling your 6 stats, you check and see, do you have at least 2 15s? If you don't, start over again, because your character needs to be heroic. This method can generate poor stats. You can end up with a 7 or an 8, but I want to make sure that you have at least 2 good stats so your character is still a hero. So instead of coming to the table with a pre-existing idea for a character, you're discovering your character. Who am I? It's like consulting the bones.
I will consult the bones. The bones tell me nothing.
And so far, I've done this with, I think, about 30 players, and none of them have ever complained, and many of them like it. They like discovering who their character is, and even experienced players, they tend to end up playing characters they'd never play. Like, one of my friends is playing a wizard, one of my friends is playing a cleric. Neither one of them really wanted to do that when they sat down, but now they really like their characters, and they're finding out, wow, being a cleric and being a wizard is really cool. So I roll 4d6, take the highest 3, but they have to do it in order, and if they don't have at least 2 15s, then they get to do it all over again. It makes heroic characters, but it also makes it a process of discovery, and I think players like that. But you are free to do it your way. In fact, you're free to invent your own way. I mean, once at a friend's house, when we were playing over the weekend for a one-shot, we all got together, and one of my friends said, hey, could I just roll a 20-sided die for each stat? And the DM said, yeah, you can, man, but then you're stuck with it. And I know it's going to sound like I'm making this up, but for real, the first thing he rolled was a 20, and everyone went insane. And the next thing he rolled was a 1. So he put the 20 in intelligence, he put the 1 in constitution, and he played a goblin wizard who was incredibly powerful with spells, but frail and weak and couldn't actually move and was carried on a litter by 4 goblin slaves. You know, we only played that one time for that weekend, so what the hell? And actually, it was the most memorable thing about that weekend. So that's a part of the juice of D&D, is making exceptions to the rules just to create memorable moments. So we've talked about generating stats and how it can be kind of, I still say, you can tell I'm old school because I call them stats instead of ability scores or whatever. We've talked about generating ability scores and how it can be kind of weird and some of the assumptions that are built into it. There's one other thing I've noticed that players have a hard time with when they sit down to play, and it generates a lot of cargo cult thinking, which if you don't know what it is, I recommend you go look up because it's super interesting. But it basically means going through a series of steps and not understanding why. And that is your proficiency modifier. It's one of the things I've noticed my new players, when they look at their character sheet and they're wondering, okay, what do I need to roll? They're often confused at where the math comes from. You roll a 20-sided die, you add the ability modifier based on whichever ability you're using, and then you add your proficiency modifier, and that's where players start to get confused. I mean, that's if they're not already confused. They're like, where is this +2 coming from? And I have to explain to them, well, there are some things that you're good at based on your class and your background because you've practiced these things or you're trained in them, and that means you are proficient at it and you get +2. But you can try to do anything. A wizard can try to pick up a sword and attack somebody with it like a fighter, but he's not trained in how to use a long sword, so he doesn't get the +2. He's not proficient in it. And I've noticed that that's one of those explanations that players, especially when they're rolling the die and they just want to find out if they hit or missed, they sit there and they tend to go, oh, okay, but they're not really processing the information because it is kind of esoteric. That's one of the challenges of playing D&D is I just want to know, did I succeed or fail? But I have to do a little bit of math. I'm rolling a d20, maybe I'm not sure why, and then I'm adding this +4 or +3, and I'm maybe not exactly sure why, and then I'm adding another number, +2, and that one seems even more arbitrary. Why is it +2 instead of +1 or +3? You know what? There's not really an answer unless you want to start talking about the fundamental math of 5th edition, which is not what this video is about. It's just something you have to accept. If you know how to do something at first level, if you're trained in it, if your background says that you're good at that, you get to add +2 to your roll. So we've talked about generating your ability scores and how weird that is and the history of that. And we've talked about the proficiency modifier and how that's a little weird and arbitrary, and it may tend to confuse your players. So the last thing I want to talk about, and it's my hope that this is going to be a short video, is party makeup and the assumptions your players make when they sit down to make characters and how sometimes that can bring them into conflict. Players, if they've played RPGs before or if they've played D&D before, this happens even with experienced players, they think that they need a balanced party. A balanced party means each role is represented. There's a healer, there's a melee fighter who has a lot of hit points and can tank for the party. Even that term, tank, it assumes that you know a lot about certain kinds of role-playing games. But even back in 1974, where that term didn't exist, you wanted the character in heavy armor with lots of hit points up front. So these roles, these ideas that we need a spellcaster, we need a thief to disarm traps, these go back all the way to the earliest days of D&D, and people just naturally playing the game tactically and wanting the weak characters with ranged attacks to be in the back of the party and the strong characters with lots of hit points to be in the front of the party. So there will always be players who advocate for a balanced party, which means somebody's got to play the cleric, for instance, even if no one wants to. And based on the way I just said that, you may understand why that can be a problem. If no one wants to play the thief character, but people in the group are saying, well, we need a thief, then you've got a problem. Now, the good news is D&D is designed with those assumptions in mind, so the designers worked to make playing a cleric, for instance, fun. You can fight in combat and do cool stuff, and with a bonus action, often heal. So that you don't really have to give up healing and fighting. The bonus action is a free thing you get to do in and amongst moving and attacking. So they did their best to make it so if your players want to have a balanced party and someone gets stuck with playing a character they don't want, they will discover that that character is still fun and effective. But I challenge the notion that you need a balanced party. If all the players want to do that, absolutely. But I have often played with players just making the character they want to play. So that's the dichotomy. Over here, you have the people who think you need a balanced party, and over here are the players who I just want to play the thing I want to play, and I don't really care what the rest of you play. Those players are not wrong. I played a game with my friend Jim Murphy, who's the best DM I've ever played with, and we didn't have a thief. And the thief's role is usually to be the character who is scouting ahead because he can disarm traps if he finds them. And we were stuck in a room with the walls closing in, and we were in danger of being crushed to death, which you may be familiar with.
One thing's for sure, we're all going to be a lot thinner.
And if we had had a thief, it would have been a simple matter for him to just make a disarm traps roll and get us out of there. But we didn't have a thief, and so we spent, I think, about an hour and a half trying to figure out how to get out of this room. It ended up being terrifying. We thought we were all going to die, and we did some desperate stuff. Now, as a result of that desperation, we managed to come up with a pretty cool idea, and we managed to make everything work and get out of that room, and it ended up being one of the most memorable parts of that entire campaign. So you see, again, there's this expectation that things should go a certain way, but some of the most memorable things I've experienced in the game were when we threw those expectations out. We didn't have a thief, and everything ended up being not only fine, but super exciting. And even if we had had a thief, what if he had failed his role? We would have been in the same situation. So that notion that you need a balanced party, which many players assume, I don't think it's accurate, because even when you do have a balanced party, you end up in situations where, for instance, you're all heavily damaged and the cleric doesn't have any spells anymore. What do you do then? Well, the same thing you would have done if you didn't have a cleric. So it must be possible to run the game without one. Now, as the DM, I do think it is your responsibility to shore up the deficiencies of the party. Let's imagine they don't have a meat shield. They have no heavy fighter, no paladin, no one with a high armor class. You may want to have there be an NPC in town who fits that description, who is willing to come hang out with the players. We'll talk about you running NPCs with the party in another episode. There are definitely things to avoid in that situation. But if, for instance, there is no cleric in the party, make sure that there is a local priest and a local temple who is willing to help out the players with potions of healing for some, for a price or for helping out with a quest. That's a classic way for players to get adventures, is because there are people that they go to for help, and those people, those NPCs, say, yeah, I'll help you out, but you need to help me. So those are the things that I think players tend to be confused by. One, why am I rolling these ability scores? Where do these numbers come from? What do they mean? Two, what is this proficiency modifier that I keep applying? Why does this math work the way it does? And three, what are the expectations of players making a party? Should it be a balanced party, or should we each just make what we want? And you should encourage your players to talk to each other about what kind of party they want to be. What if your players all want to be wizards and they're a member of a wizard's order? And it turns out, well, we still want to have a heavy fighter, so we'll have one of the characters be an eldritch knight, which is kind of a fighting wizard, or really a fighter who can cast some spells. And we still need a thief, so we'll have one of the players be an arcane trickster, which is a thief that uses magic user spells. See, I called him a magic user because I've been playing for a million years. A thief that uses wizard spells to enhance his thief abilities. So you could still have a range of characters, but all be wizard-like characters, a member of a wizard's order. Or you could all play monks and be members of a monastery. I've always wanted to play a game where we are all monks because I think monks are like the most survivable character. So you put 5 monks in a party and you're going to see some interesting stuff happen. So those opportunities are out there. It's up to your players. Encourage them to think outside the box and just suggest, hey guys, just FYI, you could all play characters that are members of a wizard's order. That's actually a great way to get everyone to a place where their characters have a reason to be together and a reason why they all know each other. One of the most memorable games I've ever played in was my friend Jordy running a game as a DM, and he told us we were going to start at 7th level, which is pretty high level. So that meant our characters all had not only cool abilities, but we had already lived a life. We should have interesting backstories at that point and have already gone on interesting adventures. And he said, you begin prisoners condemned to death. And he told us it was up to each of us to decide, why is your character condemned to death? Is your character an unrepentant sociopath? Or was your character convicted of a crime he was innocent of? Or maybe he's a political prisoner that spoke out against the state. And we were given the opportunity to go on a suicidal mission, which was so dangerous, the people in charge wouldn't risk their own men, but we were expendable. And if we did it, there was a chance that we could get our freedom. Does that sound familiar? And we ended up making an incredibly interesting group of characters. And my character, Ottavio de Caserta, was one of the most cool characters I've ever played. He was a sinister, lawful, evil character. He was a spy master captured by the enemy. I still love that guy. I would love, Jordy, if you're watching this, I would love to keep playing that game. So you can see how creating a party together, talking about what the players want to play, it doesn't have to be a scrum where you end up with a motley crew of mercenaries. You could actually put some thought into it and decide, hey, here's why we all know each other. Hey, here's why we're all stuck together in this group. So making characters in D&D can be complex. I encourage my players to use a spreadsheet that I downloaded from EN World called the Forged Anvil Character Creator. You have to have Excel for it. It is very complex because making characters in D&D can end up being really complex. I call it the executive character sheet. And it doesn't really help you understand things, but it does do all the math for you, and it makes sure that you have the right number of languages and you have the right number of skills, because you can't screw that up. Doing it by hand, you can definitely screw that stuff up. I'll link to the executive character sheet down in the doobly-doo, and you can use it if you want. It is a little bit overwhelming, and like I said, you do have to have Excel. Finally, the first 4 episodes of the series went up last week, and there was a huge, overwhelming positive response. And for that, I thank all of you, everybody who subscribed. I looked at all your comments. I read all of them. I spent a lot of time answering questions, both in public and in private. There were a couple of Reddit threads. I feel like this channel is off to a great start, and that's because of you. If you subscribe, then you'll get updates when I upload a new video. And also, you have to subscribe for the autoplay thing to work, so you will automatically watch the next video you haven't seen. And I know that a big part of my viewership right now is people from Critical Role who are here thanks to Liam O'Brien. Liam, thank you for retweeting me. There may be more interesting dice in your future. I know some of the guys in Critical Role because we happen to be in the same business, and I've spent many hours in the recording booth with Liam. I got to play D&D for one day with Liam and Marisha and Matt, and it was a lot of fun. And generally speaking, I think Critical Role is the best advocate for D&D on the web, and I think it has one of the best communities on the internet, and that's largely because Matt and Marisha and Liam and Sam and Taliesin and Ashley and Travis and Laura are all the people in real life that you would hope they would be watching Critical Role. They are fun, they are smart, they are talented, they are ethical, they're just good people, and you should watch Critical Role. So we talked about making characters and the kind of stuff that's going to happen. Next week, we're going to start talking about your campaign setting and the world that your D&D takes place in. You can buy a prepackaged campaign setting, we'll talk about those, or you can make your own, and making your own is one of the most rewarding things DMs do in D&D. Peace out.